I thought I knew the story behind this candy bar before researching it, but it turns out there were more layers to this story than I originally thought. You know how in Shrek, there's the line, ogres are like onions, equating their personalities to that of the layers of an onion? Well, the story behind this episode's topic is broken down into layers as well, which is convenient since the candy bar itself is layered with nougat, peanuts, caramel, and finally chocolate. I'm your host, Emily Prokop, and this is the story behind Baby Ruth. But first, a quick message. Are you a fan of podcasts? Take the 2 Pods a Day challenge all through the month of October by listening to 2 new podcasts every day. And if you need suggestions, follow the number 2, Pods a Day on Twitter, or visit 2podsaday.wordpress.com. Listen more, listen indie. The story I originally learned was although the name sounds familiar to Babe Ruth, and one might associate the two, the story from the makers is that it was named for President Grover Cleveland's daughter, Ruth, who was beloved when she was born. An additional story told in conjunction with that one is that Ruth Cleveland visited the Curtis Candy Company, which originally manufactured the candy bars, and the Cleveland family was instrumental in the fledgling company's future success. That's the story the Curtis Candy Company stuck with, followed by Nabisco, who bought them out, then Nestle, who now owns and produces Baby Ruth. But that's not the whole story. In fact, some, if not all of it, could be completely made up. In 1921, the Curtis Candy Company found success with a candy bar made up of a pastry, nuts, and covered in chocolate, known as candy cake, spelled with K's instead of C's. But in 1921, owner Otto Schnering changed the recipe to use caramel, peanuts, nougat, and chocolate, and renamed it Baby Ruth. When most other candy bars were 10 cents each, Schnering took the market by storm when he priced these new bars at 5 cents apiece, forcing other candy bar companies like Hershey to lower their prices. Schnering's marketing techniques also included branding them as an energy bar and a complete luncheon. He also marketed by using airplanes to drop Baby Ruths attached to little silk parachutes. Originally, Schnering wanted a new name for the candy bar, and according to one person who worked at the Curtis Candy Company, Schnering did in fact approach Babe Ruth to use his name and likeness for the new candy bar. But the price was too high, and instead he went with Baby Ruth, using the story that it was named after President Cleveland's daughter, Ruth. But that's just one person's word against a huge company, right? Well, would you be more skeptical if I told you Ruth Cleveland had never, in fact, visited the company? Or how about the fact that Grover Cleveland had been out of office 24 years before the candy bar? Also, he had been dead for 13 years before. So it's not like he was as relevant at the time. Oh, and one more thing. His daughter Ruth didn't visit the fledgling company. In fact, she would never even know a candy bar was supposedly named in her honor, since she had died of diphtheria at the age of 12, in 1904, 17 years before the candy bar was even created. But nevertheless, this was the story told for years, and the story I had even heard because who wouldn't want to be snarky and say, actually, Baby Ruth isn't named for Babe Ruth, it was named for Grover Cleveland's daughter, Ruth. It used to be listed on the Nestle website for the candy bar, but has since been taken down. Poor Babe Ruth, right? When I read about how Otto Schnering basically used his name to sell candy bars, it felt like Babe Ruth was the victim in all this. Schnering maintained he had never met with Babe Ruth, or even knew he was going to be one of the greatest baseball players at the time the candy bar was created, since Ruth was considered at the beginning of his all-star career. However, Babe Ruth wouldn't have escaped the public eye back in 1921 when he was with the New York Yankees. Even in Chicago, where Schnering and Curtis Candy Company was located, Ruth would have been making national headlines by that time. But Ruth did end up getting into the candy game soon after, and lent his name to another candy bar, Ruth's Home Run Candy. But Schnering sued him for copyright infringement because of the similar name to his product, and the courts believed his story about naming it for Ruth Cleveland and ruled that Babe Ruth was unfairly trying to cash in on his name and profit from the similarity to the already established candy bar. Schnering maintained his story of naming it for Ruth Cleveland, But candy historians point to another indicator that Babe Ruth was, in fact, the namesake. And that would be the Curtis Candy Company's second most popular candy bar, Butterfinger. A technique used in marketing known as brand extension is using a name similar to an already existing product for a new product, like we talked about in the story behind tissues, with the X in Kleenex being a brand extension for Kimberly-Clark of their already existing popular brand, Kotex. Butterfinger was picked as the name of the new candy bar in a naming contest, but there's probably a reason it worked so well, since Butterfinger was a common name to call athletes who drop the ball frequently. So if you're picturing Schnering to be basically Mr. Potter from It's a Wonderful Life, you're not alone. I thought the same thing, until I looked into him a bit more. I guess you could call the next section the nougat layer of the story. Otto Schnering was the son of German immigrant Julius Schnering. His mother, Helen Elizabeth Curtis, came from a well-to-do family in Vermont. Otto named the candy company after his mother's maiden name. Some say it was because of the negative connotations with using his German surname around the time of World War I, but others believe it was in tribute to Helen. It was common for Germans, who made up about 25% of the population in Chicago when Otto was growing up, to bring the work ethic that was traditional in their country, which included a very hands-on approach to every facet of a company. Otto was said to have worked alongside his employees with Curtis Candy Company when it was getting started, and knew how every part of the company worked, from production to marketing to finances. He was said to be a kind and gentle boss, treating his employees with the utmost respect, giving them wages far beyond those of other companies. Men were given $1.33 per hour and women 96 cents per hour, which roughly translates to $22 and $16 in today's money, respectively. These wages were also a preventative measure to avoid unions from forming and eating into the profits. Employees were also given profit sharing and weekly allotments of chickens, milk, eggs, and vegetables to help reduce living expenses. Even though it seems other candy companies were against one another, each trying to oust Hershey from its #1 spot, Otto was behind banding together to jointly advertise candy bars and became part of the National Confectioners Association Committee. They ended up coming up with a slogan in 1938 of "Candy is delicious food, eat some every day," which might make us mad today as the obesity rate increases and Americans are realizing more and more that big sugar is to blame. But at the time, the movement for people to eat more candy was partially intended to counteract the increasingly popular Lucky Strike cigarette slogan of "reach for a Lucky instead of a sweet." In 1942, right in the middle of World War II, Otto had already invested in farmland for cattle, so he would be able to produce his own milk and butter, meaning the cost of raw materials for his chocolate bars were under control. He even gave children of company employees free horseback riding lessons on this farmland. Eventually, he left the candy business to his sons and focused more on his cattle farm, finding an innovative and more sanitary way to use his cattle for artificial insemination. But that's a story for another day, and I'm going to go out on a limb and say I probably won't be the one telling it. Information for this episode was sourced from Snopes.com, immigrantentrepreneurship.org, history.com, and more links, which can be found in the show notes at thestorybehindpodcast.com. This episode was brought to you by the Story Behind executive producers, who support the show through the Patreon page at patreon.com/thestorybehind. Thanks for listening.